The otoscope's camera pushed deeper into Margaret Henderson's ear canal, and Dr. Rachel Morrison's hand froze. On the monitor, 8 curled legs materialized through the mass of green pus and white fungal growth. The nurse's pen clattered to the floor. "Jesus Christ," Morrison whispered. Stepping back from the examination chair, Maggie's fingers dug into the armrest. "What is it? What did you find?" Behind them, a metal box tumbled from Maggie's open purse, spilling its contents across the sterile tile. A purple heart medal rolled in a slow arc, coming to rest at Morrison's feet. The engraving caught the fluorescent light. Semper Fidelis, J.M.S. Morrison lifted her eyes from the medal to the screen, then to her patient's frightened face. 6 weeks earlier, none of this had begun. 6 weeks earlier, Margaret Henderson had been tending her roses, completely unaware that something was crawling toward her ear. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The morning light filtered through the kitchen window, casting long shadows across the single-place setting. Margaret Henderson, 72 years old and precise in every movement, folded the blue work shirt with practiced efficiency. The fabric was soft from decades of washing. The collar permanently creased where it had once pressed against her husband's neck. Tom had been gone 5 years, but her hands remembered the ritual. She set the shirt on the chair back and turned to the photographs lining the windowsill. Her younger self stared back from a black and white frame. 26 years old in a crisp nurse's uniform, hair pinned in the style of night. Beside it, Sarah's medical school graduation portrait. Then Emma, accepting an art award at her high school ceremony, paint somehow already on her sleeve. The radio on the counter played Sam Cooke softly. "You Send Me" had been playing the morning Tom proposed, and she'd never been able to turn it off when it came on. She hummed along as she poured coffee into a single mug, no longer bothering with the matching set. The calendar hanging beside the refrigerator showed September 1st, circled in red ink. Emma's midterm presentation was written in Maggie's careful script. 2 weeks away, she'd promised to be there. Her medicine cabinet stood open from her morning routine, revealing the half-empty bottle of ibuprofen. She'd been taking more lately. Her back, she told herself, the garden work, the house around her bore the marks of someone living alone, but refusing to admit it. Tom's side of the closet remained untouched, his clothes aging in the dark. The nightstand drawer, on what had been his side, held something else entirely. A small metal box, rusted at the corners, bound with old string. She passed it every night, never opened it. The engraving on top read, Semper Fidelis, J.M.S. In letters she'd once traced with trembling fingers. Her phone buzzed on the counter. 3 missed calls from Sarah. A text from Emma appeared. "Grandma, can I visit this weekend? Miss you," followed by a heart. Maggie typed back slowly. "After midterms, honey. Focus on school." The doorbell rang. Through the window, she saw Grace Patterson from next door, holding a covered dish. Grace was 68, a retired nurse, and persistently kind in a way that made Maggie uncomfortable. She waited until Grace's footsteps faded before opening the door. The casserole sat on the mat with a note tucked underneath. "You're too thin. Eat." Jeez, Maggie carried it inside, read the note again, and felt something catch in her throat. She set the dish on the counter and turned away quickly. Asking for help meant admitting weakness, and weakness was how you lost everything. The afternoon sun filtered through the Douglas firs surrounding Maggie's garden, casting dappled shadows across the rose bushes. She knelt on the foam pad she kept by the shed, pruning shears in hand, cutting away the dead blooms with movements that had once been automatic. Today, her hands trembled slightly. She'd noticed it that morning while pouring coffee. A fine tremor, barely visible, but there. She ignored it the same way she ignored the persistent ache in her lower back and the fact that she'd taken 4 ibuprofen tablets before lunch. The roses needed attention. That was enough. She worked methodically, moving from bush to bush. But her cuts were imprecise. Stems fell at odd angles. She paused, wiped sweat from her forehead with the back of her gardening glove, and looked at the wooden bench Tom had built in 1979. Their initials were still visible in the weathered wood employee, carved with a pocket knife during a summer when they'd still believed that forever meant something. The bench called to her, just for a moment, just to rest. She removed her gloves, set down the shears, and sat heavily. The wood was warm from the sun. Wind chimes tinkled from Grace's yard next door. A bee hummed past, fat with pollen. The Douglas firs whispered overhead. Her eyes grew heavy. She'd barely slept the night before. The ibuprofen made her drowsy. Just a moment, just a few minutes. Her breathing soaked. Her head tilted back against the bench. The afternoon sounds faded to a comfortable blur. She didn't see the small brown recluse spider emerge from a crack in the bench's armrest. Didn't feel it crawl across the wood onto the faded cotton of her sleeve up toward her shoulder. The spider paused at her collar, then continued its path along her neck. The wind shifted. A Douglas fir branch scraped against the house. Sam Cooke's voice drifted faintly from the kitchen radio, still playing through the open window. The spider reached her ear. Maggie's face twitched. Her hand rose unconsciously, brushing at the tickle, but the movement only pushed the spider deeper. It disappeared into the ear canal, legs scrambling for purchase. She slept on, unaware. 20 minutes passed before she woke with a start, disoriented. The sun had moved lower. Her neck was stiff. She sat up, rubbing her eyes, then paused. A slight itch in her right ear. She rubbed at it with one finger, felt nothing unusual, and dismissed it. She gathered her tools and headed inside, glancing back at the bench with an uneasy feeling she couldn't name. In the bathroom. She examined her reflection. Her face looked pale, she thought, tired. She tilted her head, studying her right ear. Nothing visible. Probably just water from her morning shower working its way out. She opened the medicine cabinet. Cotton swabs sat in their plastic container. She took one, dampened it with hydrogen peroxide from the brown bottle on the shelf, and inserted it carefully into her ear canal. The sensation was immediate and unpleasant. She pushed deeper, twisting slightly, trying to clear whatever was causing the itch. When she withdrew the swab, there was a small streak of blood on the white cotton, along with yellow wax. She'd scratched herself. That was all. She threw the swab away, washed her hands, and took 2 more ibuprofen tablets. The bottle was nearly empty. She'd need to buy more. Her phone buzzed. Sarah's name appeared on the screen, for the fourth time that day. Maggie stared at it, her thumb hovering over the answer button. Then let it go to voicemail. She'd call back later when she had something to say, when she didn't feel so tired. That evening, she barely touched Grace's casserole. It tasted bland, though she knew Grace was an excellent cook. She turned the television volume higher than usual, annoyed that the sound seemed muffled. At 9 o'clock, she went to bed early, positioning her head so her left ear was against the pillow. The right ear still itched, but she was too exhausted to care. In the morning, she'd find a small yellow stain on the pillowcase. She'd flip it over, change the sheets later, and tell herself it was nothing. The spider, pushed deeper by the cotton swab, its body crushed against the tympanic membrane, had already begun the process of decomposition. The first bacteria were multiplying in the warm, moist darkness. The infection that would nearly kill her had started its silent work. But Margaret Henderson, who had survived raising 3 children alone, who had survived her husband's departure, who had survived 72 years by never asking anyone for help, slept through it all. Some invasions happened in silence. The pain began as a whisper, and grew into a scream over the course of 2 weeks. September 2nd. Maggie woke to a dull ache radiating from her right ear. She took 4 ibuprofen with her morning coffee and went about her day. By evening, the pain had increased to a persistent throb. She took 4 more tablets and went to bed early. September 3rd. The pillowcase bore a larger yellow stain. She stripped the bed, started laundry, and replaced it with fresh linens. The discharge had a faint smell, sweet and slightly musty, that she attributed to earwax. She bought a new bottle of ibuprofen at the drugstore, the extra-strength kind. September 5th. Book club met at the community center. Maggie attended but chose a seat away from the circle, her head tilted perpetually left. When Grace tried to sit beside her, Maggie moved her purse to the empty chair. "Are you feeling all right?" Grace asked, her nurse's eye catching the slight flush on Maggie's cheek. "Allergies," Maggie said. "This weather—" Grace's expression suggested disbelief, but she didn't push. Not yet. September 7th. The television volume stayed at maximum. When Sarah called, Maggie could barely hear her daughter's voice through the phone. "Mom, you sound far away." "Bad connection?" Maggie lied. "I'll call you back." She didn't call back. The laundry basket in her bedroom filled with pillowcases, all bearing the yellow-green stains. She washed them separately, running the machine on the hottest setting, as if heat could erase the evidence of what was happening inside her skull. September 10th. She stopped sleeping in her bed entirely. The pain was too intense when she lay flat. Instead, she slept in the living room recliner, sitting upright, her head supported by a travel pillow. She woke every hour, reaching for the ibuprofen bottle she now kept on the side table. September 11th. Emma called via video chat. Maggie answered with audio only. "Grandma, turn on your camera. I want to see you." "It's broken. Honey, how's school? Tell me about your midterm project." Emma's excitement poured through the speaker. She was creating something about strength, about women in her family. She wanted Maggie to be there for the presentation. "I'll be there," Maggie promised. "Oh, I wouldn't miss it." After they hung up, Maggie stared at her reflection in the darkened television screen. Even in the distorted glass, she could see the swelling on the right side of her face. September 3. Grace's visits increased. She knocked every morning, always with something: soup, bread, a magazine. Maggie stopped answering the door. She'd watch through the window as Grace stood on the porch, waiting, then finally leaving whatever she'd brought with a note tucked underneath. The notes grew more insistent. "I know something's wrong. Please let me help. I'm not leaving you alone in this." Maggie read each one, crumpled it, and threw it away. September 14th. Grace let herself in. Maggie had given her a spare key years ago, back when they'd been closer, back when Maggie had still believed in the myth of friendship without obligation. She heard the key in the lock, heard Grace calling her name, and considered pretending she wasn't home. But she was too tired to move from the recliner. Grace found her there, awake but dazed, the television playing to an empty room. Grace approached slowly, her expression shifting from concern to alarm. She stopped 5 feet away, her nose wrinkling involuntarily. "Oh, honey," she said softly. "What is that smell?" "I showered this morning," Maggie said defensively. "It's not that. It's medical. Maggie, please." Grace came closer, and Maggie saw the exact moment her friend's professional training kicked in. Grace's eyes focused on Maggie's right ear, where discharge had crusted on the lobe despite her attempts to clean it. The right side of her face was visibly swollen now, the skin flushed and hot to the touch. "We're going to the hospital," Grace said. "Now, I'm fine. It's just an ear infection. For 2 weeks. Grace's voice rose. "Maggie, I was a nurse for 40 years. And I was a nurse, too," Maggie shouted, immediately regretting the volume. The pain in her ear spiked, sharp and blinding. "I know what I'm doing." "Then why does your face look like that?" Maggie's hand rose to her cheek, touched the swollen skin, and winced. Grace sat down, her voice dropping to something gentler. "I lost Bill because he waited too long. A mole on his back. 'It's nothing,' he kept saying. By the time he finally went in, the melanoma was stage 4. He died 6 months later." The silence stretched between them. "Don't make me watch you die, too," Grace whispered. Maggie felt something crack inside her chest, not breaking, but fracturing, the first small fissure in the wall she'd spent 5 years building. "I'll call my doctor tomorrow," she said finally. "I'm staying tonight." "No, you don't need to." "Then I'm calling her right now." Maggie closed her eyes, defeated. "Fine, stay." Grace settled into the couch, pulling an Afghan over her lap. Neither of them slept much. Grace dozed fitfully, waking every hour to check on Maggie. Maggie stared at the ceiling, counting the minutes until dawn, trying to convince herself she could handle one more day. September the 15th. Maggie woke to pain that made her vision blur. She took 4 ibuprofen, then 4 more an hour later. Grace made breakfast that Maggie couldn't eat. "I'm going to Emma's presentation this afternoon," Maggie announced. "I promised her. Let me drive you. I need to stop at the farmer's market first, get flowers for her." Grace studied her face, saw the determination there mixed with something that looked like desperation, and nodded. "I'm coming with you." They never made it to Emma's presentation. The Saturday morning farmer's market sprawled across 3 blocks of downtown Portland. a riot of color and noise that pressed against Maggie's senses like a physical weight. She'd insisted on coming, had insisted on the wide-brimmed hat and dark sunglasses that now made her look like she was hiding from someone, which, she supposed, she was. Grace walked beside her, close enough to catch her if she stumbled. Maggie resented the hovering even as she leaned on it. The flower stand was at the far end, past the vegetable vendors and the artisan bread makers and the woman selling handmade soaps that smelled of lavender. Maggie fixed her eyes on it and walked, each step requiring more concentration than the last. The world tilted slightly to the right. She compensated by leaning left. "Yellow roses," she told the vendor, a man who'd been selling flowers at this market for 15 years. "A dozen." He looked at her, his smile fading. "Mrs. Henderson, you look pale. Are you feeling all right?" She didn't answer, just fumbled with her wallet. Her fingers felt thick and clumsy. The bills seemed to swim in front of her eyes. Grace paid, while Maggie gripped the edge of the wooden counter, the high-pitched ringing in her ear, constant for days now, suddenly increased in volume. The market sounds, already muffled, began to fade further. The colors of the produce stand started to bleed and blur, watercolors running together. "Maggie." Grace's voice came from very far away. She reached for the counter and missed. Her hand swept through empty air and knocked into a display of oranges. They tumbled, rolling across the pavement in every direction, bright spheres of color in her narrowing vision. She felt herself falling but couldn't stop it. The ground came up slowly, or maybe she went down quickly. Time doing something strange and elastic. She turned her head at the last moment, and the impact jarred through her skull, lighting up every nerve in her infected ear like a firework. Grace's face appeared above her, mouth moving, but Maggie couldn't hear the words over the screaming in her head. Other faces joined Grace's. Someone was dialing 911. Someone else was clearing pace around her. A teenager held up a phone, recording. Maggie tried to speak, managed only, "Emma, presentation." Then the world faded to gray, then to nothing. She came back to awareness in pieces, sirens, movement, bright lights overhead sliding past, Grace's hand gripping hers. A male voice asking questions she couldn't quite parse. "Can you hear me, ma'am?" She tried to nod. Everything hurt. "Can you tell me your name?" "Margaret." Her own voice sounded wrong, thick and slurred. "Henderson." "Do you know what day it is?" She didn't. Time had become soup. The paramedic's face swam into focus. Young, concerned, professional. He was shining a light in her eyes, checking her pupils. Then he turned her head gently to examine her right ear, and she saw his expression change. "Brian," he called to his partner, "look at this." The second paramedic leaned in. "Is that drainage?" "Yeah, and the face is drooping on that side. I was thinking stroke. But that smell, you smell that?" "Yeah." The first paramedic looked down at Maggie. "Ma'am, we're taking you to Bayside Medical. We're leaving now." The ambulance ride blurred together. Grace rode with her, still holding her hand, murmuring reassurances that Maggie couldn't quite hear. At some point, her purse fell from the stretcher, spilling its contents across the ambulance floor. Grace bent to gather everything, her hands pausing on the metal box before she picked it up, read the engraving, and looked at Maggie with questions in her eyes. But there was no time for questions. They were already pulling up to the emergency bay. The emergency room was controlled chaos. Dr. Rachel Morrison appeared within 15 minutes of Maggie's arrival. Summoned by the ER physician who'd taken one look in her ear and called for a specialist immediately, Morrison was 42, calm in the way of people who'd seen worse and knew panic helped nothing. She wore her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and rimless glasses that gave her a studious air. She sat down at eye level with Maggie, who'd been placed in an examination room with the lights dimmed. "Mrs. Henderson, I'm Dr. Morrison. I'm an ear, nose, and throat specialist. I need to examine you and ask you some questions. Is that all right?" Maggie nodded. Cooperation seemed easier than resistance. "When did your symptoms start?" Maggie had to think. Time had gotten slippery. 2 weeks, maybe 3. Grace, standing in the corner, said quietly, "At least 2 weeks that I know of. Have you had any recent head trauma? Do you swim in lakes or rivers? No. Any chronic illnesses? Diabetes, high blood pressure? No. What medications are you currently taking?" "Just ibuprofen." A pause. "A lot of it." Morrison made notes, then stood and prepared her examination equipment. A young nurse named Jamie helped set up the video otoscope, the large monitor on the wall flickering to life. A resident, Dr. Chen, hovered nervously in the background, observing. "I'm going to look in your ear now," Morrison said. "The camera will let my team see what I'm seeing. It might be uncomfortable, but I'll be as gentle as possible." She started with the left ear. The image on the monitor showed a normal ear canal, healthy pink tissue, intact eardrum. Morrison switched to the right ear, and her hand stilled the moment the otoscope entered the canal. The monitor showed swelling, angry red inflammation, and discharge. Morrison used a suction tube to clear some of the debris. Maggie whimpered at the pain. "Almost done," Morrison murmured. She maneuvered the camera deeper, the image on screen revealing layers of infection, white patches of what looked like fungal growth, green-tinged pus, and then, as she adjusted the focus, something else. Jamie's pen hit the floor with a clatter. "Doctor," she said, her voice tight. "What is that?" Morrison zoomed in. The image sharpened. 8 legs became visible, curled and motionless, surrounded by the infection they'd caused. Chen took a step back. "Is that alive?" Morrison withdrew the scope slowly and set it down. She removed her gloves, took a breath, and sat back down in front of Maggie. "Mrs. Henderson, I need you to stay calm. There's a foreign body in your ear canal." "What kind of foreign body?" Grace asked. Morrison chose her words carefully. "A spider? A brown recluse spider from the markings? It's deceased, but it's been there long enough to cause a severe infection." Maggie stood at her. "That's not possible. I wish it weren't, but I'm looking at it on the screen. The spider's body has caused a foreign body reaction. You have a bacterial infection. We're seeing Pseudomonas aeruginosa based on the color and scent. There's also a fungal component, Aspergillus. And based on your facial droop and the CT scan I'm about to order, I believe the infection has spread to your mastoid bone." The words washed over Maggie like cold water. A spider inside her head for weeks. We need to admit you immediately, Morrison continued. You'll need IV antibiotics and antifungals. Surgery is likely necessary to remove the infected tissue. If we don't act quickly, the infection could spread to your brain. But Emma's presentation, Maggie said, her voice small. I promised. Grace moved to her side, took her hand. Is not more important than your life. Morrison was already writing orders. I need to know who your emergency contact is. Who should we call? Grace answered when Maggie didn't. Her daughter, Sarah Henderson. She's a pediatrician in Seattle. Please call her. Tell her she should come now. While Grace stepped into the hallway to make the call, Morrison explained what would happen next. CT scan, admission to ICU, cultures taken, IV lines placed, surgery scheduled, probably for tomorrow morning. The risks: permanent hearing loss, facial paralysis, meningitis, death. Maggie heard the words but couldn't quite connect them to herself. This was something that happened to other people. People who weren't careful. People who didn't know better. How did it get in? She asked. Morrison hesitated. Most likely you were sleeping outdoors or near an open window. Spiders crawl into ears seeking warmth and darkness. It's rare, but it happens. The garden bench, the afternoon nap. Maggie remembered brushing at her ear, remembered the cotton swab she'd used afterward. She'd pushed it deeper herself. The cotton swab, she said. I used a cotton swab. Morrison's expression was carefully neutral. That would have pushed it further in and likely perforated your eardrum, which allowed the infection to spread. It was her fault, all of it. Her fault for falling asleep in the garden. Her fault for not going to a doctor immediately. Her fault for thinking she could handle everything alone. Grace returned. Sarah's on her way. 3 hours. They moved Maggie to a wheelchair for the CT scan. As they rolled her through the hallways, she caught glimpses of other patients, other families, other emergencies unfolding. A child with a broken arm, an elderly man struggling to breathe, a young woman holding her pregnant belly, life happening to people who weren't her. The CT scan took 20 minutes. Maggie lay perfectly still in the massive machine, listening to it click and whir around her. She thought about the spider, dead inside her skull. She thought about Emma, waiting at her presentation for a grandmother who wouldn't come. She thought about Sarah, driving down the highway, probably crying, probably angry, probably scared. She thought about the metal box Grace had picked up in the ambulance, now sitting with her belongings. The box she'd carried for 56 years without opening. The box that held the only man who'd ever really seen her. Back in the ICU room, they started the IV antibiotics. The nurse explained they'd be using ciprofloxacin and metronidazole for the bacteria, and voriconazole for the fungus. Each medication had its own drip, its own timing, its own potential side effects. Maggie watched the clear fluids enter her arm and thought about how quickly everything had fallen apart. 2 weeks ago, she'd been fine, independent, in control. Now she couldn't even control what was growing inside her own body. Grace pulled a chair close to the bed and settled in. I'm not leaving? You don't have to stay. Yes, I do. Because if I don't, you'll try to leave. You'll convince yourself you're fine, and you'll walk out of here, and you'll die. The bluntness shocked Maggie into silence. I know you, Grace continued. I know you think asking for help makes you weak. I know you'd rather die than admit you need someone. but I'm not letting you. Not this time. Maggie turned her head away, but Grace kept talking. Bill died because he was too stubborn to see a doctor about a mole. A mole, Maggie. Something that would have taken 5 minutes to check. And I have to live with knowing I could have forced him, could have dragged him to that appointment, but I didn't. I respected his independence, and he died. Grace's voice cracked. I'm not making that mistake twice. Maggie closed her eyes. The antibiotics were making her drowsy. Or maybe it was just exhaustion, the kind that came from fighting a losing battle for too long. Okay, she whispered. Okay. Sarah Henderson ran through the hospital corridor still wearing her work scrubs, her white coat flapping behind her like wings. She'd driven 3 hours in 2.5. Hands gripping the steering wheel so hard her knuckles had gone white. Every mile, the guilt had grown heavier. Every missed call, every unreturned voicemail, every time she'd been too busy to listen. She found the ICU on the 4th floor and stopped outside room 412, her hand pressed against the glass window. Inside, her mother lay in the bed, small and pale and wrapped in white bandages, IV lines snaking from her arms like vines. Grace sat in the chair beside her, head bowed, possibly praying. Sarah pushed open the door quietly. Grace looked up and stood immediately, pulling Sarah into a hug that smelled like lavender soap in hospitals. She's stable, Grace whispered. They're prepping for surgery in the morning. Sarah approached the bed slowly. Her mother's eyes were closed, but her breathing was steady. The right side of her face was swollen, the bandages covering her ear and temple. She looked 72 for the first time in Sarah's memory. She'd always been so vital, so sturdy. Seeing her like this felt like looking at a stranger. Sarah sat down and took her mother's hand. The skin was papery and cool. Maggie's eyes opened. You didn't have to come. The words hit Sarah like a slap. She had to take a breath before she could respond. Yes, I did. They looked at each other, decades of unspoken things hanging in the air between them. Why didn't you call me? Sarah's voice came out harder than she intended. You're always so busy. Don't! Sarah stood up, needing to move. Don't make this about me being busy. You knew this was serious. I didn't want to bother you. Sarah laughed, the sound bitter. Bother me. You'd rather die than bother me. Grace shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Maggie's jaw tightened. I raised 3 kids while your father was deployed, Maggie said. I survived him leaving. I don't need to be a burden to anyone now. A burden? Sarah's voice rose despite her efforts to stay calm. I'm your daughter. I'm a doctor. And you'd rather have a dead spider in your ear for 6 weeks than call me Sarah. Grace interjected gently. She's been through enough today. Sarah turned on her. And where were you? You knew she was sick. You saw her every day. Grace stood defensive. I tried. She wouldn't let me help. She locked me out. Then you should have called me. I should have, Grace said quietly. You're right. I should have. The anger drained out of Sarah as quickly as it had come. She sat back down heavily, putting her head in her hands. I'm sorry. This isn't your fault. It's not yours either, Grace said. But Sarah wasn't sure she believed that. 2 weeks ago, When her mother had called, Sarah had been seeing patients. She'd let it go to voicemail. Then she'd forgotten to call back. And the week before that, and the week before that, always too busy. Always meaning to call tomorrow. "Mom," Sarah said, looking up, "I should have listened. When you called 2 weeks ago, I was with a patient, and I thought I'll call her back after, but then I got busy, and I forgot. And then it was too late, and I should have known something was wrong." Maggie's face softened slightly. "I didn't tell you the truth. I should have heard it anyway." The door opened, and Dr. Morrison entered, carrying a tablet and a thick folder of consent forms. She introduced herself to Sarah with a handshake, doctor to doctor, a moment of professional recognition passing between them. "Your mother needs surgery tomorrow morning at 7, Morrison said. "We'll perform a mastoidectomy to remove the infected bone tissue and decompress the facial nerve." Sarah slipped into clinical mode, the familiar territory of medical terminology providing some comfort. What's the damage to the nerve? Significant compression? There's necrotic tissue surrounding it. I'll do my best to preserve function. But I need you to understand the risks. There's a 30% chance of permanent facial paralysis, 60% chance of hearing loss in that ear, and a 10% chance of further complications, including meningitis or intracranial abscess. Sarah processed the numbers, her medical training keeping her voice steady even as her heart raced. "What's your recommendation?" "Surgery is necessary. Without it, the infection will continue to spread. With it, she has a good chance of recovery, though likely with some permanent deficits." Maggie had been listening quietly. "Will I look like this forever?" Morrison sat down, meeting her eyes. "The swelling will go down. The paralysis may improve over time. Some patients regain full function. Others regain partial function. Some see no improvement. We won't know which category you fall into for several weeks. And if I don't have the surgery, then the infection will reach your brain and you'll die." The bluntness was necessary. Maggie needed to understand. Sarah reached for her mother's hand again. "Mom, you're having the surgery." For once. Maggie didn't argue. Morrison left the consent forms and departed to prepare. Grace excused herself to get coffee, sensing the two women needed time alone. The ICU room was quiet, except for the beeping of monitors and the hiss of the oxygen feed. Sarah pulled her chair closer to the bed. I'm scared," Maggie said finally, her voice small. "Me too." They sat in silence for a moment. Then Sarah noticed her mother's purse in the corner, the metal box visible through the open top. She retrieved it, studying the engraving in the dim light. Semper Fi, 1908, JMS. "Mom, what is this?" Maggie's expression changed, something between panic and resignation crossing her face. "Where did you find it?" "It fell out of your purse in the ambulance. Grace picked it up." "You didn't open it?" It wasn't a question, but Sarah answered anyway. "No. Should I have?" Maggie closed her eyes. When she opened them again, they were wet with tears. "After the surgery. If I don't make it through, you should read what's inside." "Mom, don't say that. Please. Sarah, I need you to promise me. Read it. Show it to Emma. You both deserve to know." "Know what?" But before Maggie could answer, the door opened again for her. Grace returned, but she wasn't alone. Behind her stood a young woman in paint-stained jeans and an oversized sweatshirt, her dark hair pulled into a messy bun. "Emma! Grandma!" Emma rushed to the bedside, her eyes twice her wide with shock at seeing her grandmother's condition. "Grace texted me. I drove straight here. What happened?" Sarah watched her daughter bend over her mother, watched 3 generations of women connected by blood and secrets and love that didn't know how to express itself. Emma took Maggie's hand with the easy affection that Sarah had never quite mastered. "There was a spider in my ear," Maggie said, managing a weak smile. "Turns out I'm not as tough as I thought. The doctors are going to fix it, though." "Right." Emma looked to Sarah for reassurance. "Tomorrow morning? Surgery." Emma pulled up another chair, settling in on the opposite side of the bed from Sarah. "Then I'm staying tonight. We all are." "You have classes," Maggie protested. "And you have surgery. Classes can wait." Maggie looked around at the 3 women surrounding her, tears streaming down her face now. "You all have better things to do than sit in a hospital." "No," Emma said firmly. "We really don't." Sarah felt something shift in the room, some invisible barrier beginning to crack. They spent the evening like that, taking turns sitting with Maggie, making conversation about small things, avoiding the surgery and the spider and all the things that still needed to be said. Grace brought sandwiches from the cafeteria that no one really ate. Emma sketched in her notebook, her pencil moving across the page in quick, sure strokes. Sarah read through Maggie's chart 3 times, looking for something she might have missed, some way to make the odds better. At midnight, a nurse came in to prep Maggie for surgery. No food or water after midnight, pre-op antibiotics, consent forms signed. Emma had fallen asleep in her chair, head tilted at an angle that would give her a sore neck. Sarah watched her daughter sleep and remembered being that young, that certain that love could fix everything. Grace squeezed Sarah's shoulder. "I'm going home for a few hours. I'll be back before she goes into surgery." "Thank you," Sarah said, "for everything, for not giving up on her." "That's what family does," Grace said, "even when they're not blood." After Grace left, Sarah was alone with her mother and daughter. She looked at the metal box still sitting on the bedside table and picked it up again, feeling the weight of it, the history contained in something so small. "Mom," she whispered, not wanting to wake Emma. "Who is James?" But Maggie had finally drifted to sleep, sedated by the pre-op medications. Sarah held the box for a long time, her thumb tracing the engraving, wondering what secrets her mother had carried all these years. The surgery lasted 3 hours and 47 minutes. Sarah and Emma spent every one of them in the waiting room, watching the clock on the wall tick forward with agonizing slowness. Emma had brought the metal box with her, turning it over in her hands, studying the engraving. "Who's J.M.S.? "I don't know," Sarah admitted. "But your grandmother said we should read what's inside if she doesn't make it." "Don't say that." "She said it, not me." They opened the box together. Inside, carefully preserved, lay pieces of a life Sarah had never known existed. A black and white photograph of a young man in Marine Corps dress uniform, handsome with kind eyes and an uncertain smile. Dog tags reading Sullivan, Sam. A folded letter, the paper yellowed with age, worn at the creases. A purple heart medal, a single dried rose, pressed flat and fragile. Emma picked up the photograph, turning it over on the back. In handwriting Sarah didn't recognize, Jamie, VA Hospital, March 19th. He was a patient, Sarah said quietly. When your grandmother worked at the VA. Emma unfolded the letter carefully, and they read it together. It was dated August 28th, 2024, just over 2 weeks ago. The handwriting was shaky, written by someone in pain or very weak, but the words were clear. As they read, Sarah felt her understanding of her mother shift and reform. The affair with a dying soldier, the guilt carried for 56 years, the love that had never fully died, the final letter arriving just before the spider crawled into her mother's ear, containing words that could have saved her if she'd let them. She loved him, Emma said, tears streaming down her face. For her whole life, she loved him and never told anyone. But Sarah's voice was tired. She just carried it alone. He died 3 weeks ago, Emma said, pointing to the date. And she got sick right after. The timing was impossible to ignore. Grief had weakened her, made her careless, left her vulnerable to something as small and random as a spider seeking warmth. Sarah thought about the phone calls her mother hadn't returned, the careful distance she'd maintained even in their closest moments. She'd thought it was just her mother's personality, the stoic independence of her generation. She hadn't realized it was armor, protection against letting anyone too close again. At 4:15, Morrison emerged from the surgical wing, still in her scrubs, exhaustion evident in her eyes. Sarah and Emma stood immediately. "She made it through," Morrison said, and Sarah's knees nearly buckled with relief. "We removed all the infected tissue. The mastoid bone was severely compromised, but we were able to preserve the facial nerve. It's intact, but traumatized. We won't know about function for 48 to 72 hours. "What are her chances?" Sarah asked, slipping back into doctor mode because it was easier than being just a daughter. 50-50. The nerve is viable, but the degree of recovery is impossible to predict. She might regain full function, or partial, or none. "Can we see her?" "She's in recovery now. Another hour, then yes." After Morrison left, Sarah and Emma sat back down. The letter lay between them on the chair, its words now burned into their memories. "We have to tell her we read it," Emma said. "She told us to. No, I mean, we have to tell her it's okay, that we understand, that we're not angry." Sarah picked up the letter, reading it again. "I'm not angry. I'm sad. For her. For carrying this alone for so long. For Dad, too," Emma added quietly. "He left because he felt it, even if he didn't know why." Sarah thought about her father, about the 5 years of silence between them, because she'd chosen her mother's side without knowing the full story. She thought about how many lives had been shaped by one woman's choice to love 2 men and tell no one, when they were finally allowed into recovery. Maggie was barely conscious, the anesthesia still pulling her under. Her head was wrapped in fresh bandages, the right side of her face slack and unmoving. Sarah took her hand. "Mom, it's Sarah. You made it. The surgery is over." Maggie's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and confused. She tried to speak, but only managed to whisper, "Emma, I'm here too, Grandma." Emma moved to the other side of the bed. Maggie's hand rose slowly to her face, touching the bandages, then moving to her right cheek. She tried to smile, and only the left side of her mouth moved. The realization hit her immediately. Sarah watched her mother's expression crumble. "My face," Maggie whispered. "I can't feel my face." "It's just swelling," Sarah said quickly, the lie automatic. "Dr. Morrison said it needs time to heal." But Maggie wasn't fooled. She could see the truth in Sarah's eyes, in the careful way the nurse was avoiding looking at her directly. Her right side was paralyzed. She was broken. Tears leaked from her left eye. The right eye stayed dry, unable to produce tears, unable to close fully. "I want to sleep," Maggie said. "Please, just let me sleep." They moved her to ICU room 412 within the hour. Sarah and Emma stayed while she drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes lucid, sometimes confused, always reaching up to touch the dead side of her face as if she could will it back to life through sheer force of contact. That night, after Emma had finally gone home and Sarah was alone with her sleeping mother, she opened the letter again and read the last lines. "You gave me a reason to live when I had none. Give yourself one now." Sarah looked at her mother, at the lopsided face and the bandages and the monitors tracking every heartbeat. She thought about the spider that had nearly killed her, but also about the pride that had led it, about the secrets that had poisoned slowly over decades, about the walls her mother had built so high that even dying hadn't been reason enough to ask for help. She folded the letter and placed it back in the box, but left the box open on the bedside table where her mother would see it when she woke. Some secrets had been kept too long. Some truths needed light. The next 2 days were the darkest of Maggie's life. She woke on the morning of September 17th to find a physical therapist standing beside her bed with a clipboard and an encouraging smile that Maggie wanted to scrape off her face. "Good morning, Mrs. Henderson. I'm Lisa. We're going to work on some facial exercises today." Maggie turned her head away. "I know it's difficult, but the sooner we start, the better chance we have of regaining function." "Go away." Lisa didn't go away. She pulled up a chair and sat down at eye level. "I'm going to ask you to try some movements. Just do your best." I said, "Go away. Try to wrinkle your nose for me." Maggie glared at her but complied. The left side of her nose wrinkled. The right side did nothing. She could feel the disconnect, her brain sending signals that went nowhere, died somewhere in the damaged nerve. "Good. Now try to puff out your cheeks." Maggie tried. Air escaped immediately from the right side. She couldn't hold it. Try to close both eyes. The left eye closed. The right stayed partially open, the eyelid drooping but unable to complete the movement. Maggie could feel the air drying her eye, the uncomfortable exposure. "You're doing great," Lisa said. "These exercises are important. The more you practice, the better your chances of recovery." But Maggie had stopped listening. She stared at the wall, at nothing, at the blank space where her future used to be. After Lisa left, Sarah arrived with coffee and the careful, gentle voice people used with the dying. "Mom, you need to eat something." "I'm not hungry." "The nurse said you haven't eaten since before surgery." "I can't." It was true. When she tried to eat, food fell out of the paralyzed side of her mouth. She'd tried that morning with Jell-O and had watched it slide down her chin like she was an infant. The humiliation had been worse than the hunger. Sarah set down the coffee and sat in the chair Lisa had vacated. Dr. Morrison says you're healing well. The infection is responding to the antibiotics. My face is paralyzed. It might not be permanent. It might be. Sarah had no answer to that. Grace arrived around noon with flowers and a determined expression. She pulled the curtains open, flooding the room with September sunshine that made Maggie wince. "Enough," Grace announced. "We're doing this the hard way." "Doing what?" Grace pulled her chair directly in front of Maggie's bed, close enough that Maggie couldn't look away. "You're alive. That's what matters. I look like a monster. You look like someone who survived. I look broken." "Then you look human," Grace said sharply. "Because we're all broken. Maggie, every single one of us. The only difference is some of us are honest about it." Maggie turned her head away, but Grace kept talking. "Bill died because he was too proud to see a doctor about a mole. A mole, Maggie, something that would have taken 5 minutes. And I have to live every day knowing I could have forced him, could have dragged him to that appointment. But I didn't. I respected his independence." Grace's voice cracked. "And he died. And I lost 43 years of marriage because he couldn't ask for help. So don't you dare tell me you're a monster for surviving." The silence that followed was heavy, with things neither woman knew how to say. Finally, Maggie whispered, "I can't live like this." "Yes, you can. You just don't want to." The night of September 18th was the worst. Sarah and Emma had gone home, exhausted after Maggie had insisted she was fine and wanted to sleep. Grace had been forced to leave when visiting hours ended at 9. Alone in her ICU room, surrounded by beeping machines and the soft sounds of other people's suffering, Maggie stared at the IV line in her arm. It would be so easy. Just pull it out. Pull out all the lines. Let nature take its course. Let the infection win. She'd survived so much. Tom's deployment, raising 3 children alone, James's love, and then his absence. Tom leaving, 72 years of staying strong. But she couldn't survive this. Couldn't survive the face that wasn't hers anymore, the weakness that everyone could see, the dependence on nurses to help her shower, on Sarah to cut her food, on Grace to reassure her that she wasn't a monster. Her hand reached for the IV line. The door opened. A night nurse entered, older woman with gray hair and kind eyes that had seen everything. She looked at Maggie, at her hand on the IV, and knew immediately what she'd interrupted. "Don't even think about it," the nurse said calmly. She pulled up a chair and sat down. "I was going to do my rounds, but I think I'll stay here instead." "You don't understand. My husband had a stroke 3 years into our marriage, left side completely paralyzed. He was 31 years old. He wanted to die too." The nurse settled into the chair. "That was 11 years ago. Last month he walked our daughter down the aisle. Still drags his left foot a little, still can't use his left hand much, but he walked her down that aisle, and he danced with her at the reception, and he was the happiest man in that room." "That's different." "No, it's not. It's the same fear, the same loss, the same feeling that you're not yourself anymore." The nurse leaned forward. "But here's what I learned. You're not the same. You can't be. But that doesn't mean you're less. It means you're different, and different can still be beautiful." Maggie's hand fell away from the IV line. The nurse stayed for another hour, talking about nothing important and everything important, about her husband learning to tie his shoes one-handed, about their daughter's wedding, about the ways people adapt and survive and find joy in bodies that don't work the way they used to. When she finally left to continue her rounds, Maggie lay awake staring at the ceiling. She thought about James's letter, about his words, "Let people help. Let people love you." She thought about Sarah and Emma reading that letter, learning secrets that Maggie had protected for 56 years. She thought about Tom leaving because he'd felt the ghost of James between them every single day. She thought about Grace, who'd lost her husband to pride and was determined not to lose her friend to the same thing. She thought about the spider, tiny and random and lethal, not because of its venom, but because of what it represented. All the small things ignored until they became catastrophic. All the help refused until it was almost too late. On the morning of September 20th, Emma arrived at 7 with her sketchbook and a determined expression that reminded Maggie painfully of herself at that age. "Grandma, we need to talk." Maggie braced herself for the conversation she'd been dreading. The questions about James, the judgment about the affair, the disappointment. Emma sat down and opened her sketchbook. Inside were sketches from the night of the surgery. Maggie asleep in the hospital bed, Sarah crying, their hands joined together. Page after page of family rendered in pencil and charcoal. "You know what I see in these?" Emma asked. Maggie shook her head. "A family that almost lost each other." Emma took a breath. "We read James's letter." Maggie went very still. "You had no right. You told us to, before a surgery. Remember?" Maggie did remember, vaguely. Through the haze of pre-op medication, she'd wanted them to know, had been afraid she'd die without telling them. But now, alive and facing the consequences, she wished she'd kept silent. "He loved you," Emma continued. "For 56 years. He loved you. It was wrong. I was married. I had children." "You were human," Emma said simply. "You were lonely and scared, and Dad was gone, and James was there. You fell in love. That's not wrong. That's just life." "I destroyed my marriage." "Did you? Or did you and Grandpa both hold on to something that was already broken?" Maggie had no answer to that. Emma pulled out the letter, now carefully preserved in a plastic sleeve. "He says you saved him, that loving you gave him a reason to live. And I couldn't even save myself. But you did. You're here. You survived. I didn't want to. Last night, I almost—" Maggie stopped, unable to finish. Emma's eyes filled with tears. "I'm glad you didn't. I'm so glad you didn't." They sat in silence for a moment. Then Emma said quietly, "Tell me about him, about James." So Maggie did. She told Emma about March 19th skate, about the young Marine with burns covering 60% of his body, who'd wanted to die until Maggie convinced him to live, about reading poetry to him, about the 6 months they'd had together before Tom came home, about the choice she'd made and the guilt she'd carried and the box she'd kept for 56 years as proof that it had been real. "Tom knew," Maggie said finally. "He never said anything, but he knew. I could feel it in the way he looked at me, like I was a stranger wearing his wife's face." "Is that why he left?" "Partly. Mostly because I couldn't love him the way he deserved. Part of me was always in that hospital with James." The door opened, and Sarah entered, stopping short when she saw them together, saw the letter between them. "How long have you known?" Sarah asked Emma. "3 days. I wanted Grandma to tell you herself." Sarah looked at her mother. "Is this why Dad left?" Maggie couldn't meet her eyes. "Yes." Sarah's face went through several emotions in quick succession: anger, hurt, disbelief, and finally something that might have been understanding. "You let me think it was his fault for 5 years." "It was his fault, too," Maggie said defensively. "He gave up. He left. You left first." Sarah's voice rose. "Emotionally, he stayed in a marriage with someone who was in love with a ghost. I stayed. I raised you. I was there. Being there isn't the same as being present." Emma stood up, placing herself physically between them. "Stop, both of you. You're fighting because you're scared. Go. Scared of needing each other. Scared of being hurt. Scared of being human." Both women fell silent. Emma looked at Sarah. "You're angry because Grandma's human, because she made mistakes and had secrets and wasn't perfect." Then she turned to Maggie. "And you're defensive because you know she's right." The truth of it hung in the air. Sarah sat down slowly. "Mom, I'm not angry you loved someone else. I'm angry you never trusted me with the truth. I was ashamed." "Of what? Of being lonely, of being human?" Maggie's voice broke. "Of failing at everything, at marriage, at being strong, at being the mother you deserved." Sarah took her mother's hand. "You didn't fail. You raised 3 kids alone. You survived. You taught me to be strong." "Too strong," Maggie whispered. "I taught you to never need anyone, just like me. And look where it got you." That afternoon, Grace appeared at the door with someone unexpected. Tom Henderson stood behind her, hat in his hands, looking older than Maggie remembered. 5 years had carved new lines in his face, turned his hair completely gray. But his eyes were the same, still holding that mixture of hurt and resignation that had been there the day he left. Sarah saw him first. "What is he doing here?" Grace stepped forward. "I called him. He deserved to know." "She's sleeping," Sarah said, moving to block the door. "No, I'm not." Maggie's voice came from the bed. Tom entered slowly, and Maggie watched him take in the bandages, the IV lines, the paralyzed face. She wanted to hide, to pull the blanket over her head like a child. Instead, she turned her face away. "You shouldn't have come." "Grace called. She said you almost died." "Well, I didn't, so you can leave now." With Sarah and Grace exchanged glances. Grace touched Sarah's arm. "Let's give them privacy." "Mom!" Sarah looked uncertain. "It's fine," Maggie said, though nothing about this was fine. The 2 women left, closing the door behind them. Tom stood awkwardly near the foot of the bed, still holding his hat. The silence stretched between them, filled with 5 years of words neither had said. Finally, Tom pulled a chair close and sat down. Not too close. Respecting the distance that had always been there, even when they'd shared a bed. "I heard about the surgery, about everything. Grace talks too much. She cares about you." Maggie didn't respond. She kept her face turned toward the window, showing him the good side, hiding the broken half. Tom set his hat on his knee. "I knew about James from the beginning." Maggie's head snapped around, forgetting about hiding. "What?" "I came home in '69. You were different, distant. I found a letter in your nursing bag one day. You'd forgotten to throw it away. It was from him, thanking you for everything, for giving him a reason to live." Maggie stared at him, unable to process this. "Why didn't you say anything?" "Because I loved you, and I thought if I was patient enough, loving enough, you'd forget him." Tom's voice was steady, but his hands betrayed him, twisting the hat brim. "But you can't compete with a memory. Memories don't argue or get old or fail. They stay perfect forever, frozen in that moment. You didn't fail." "Yes, I did. I gave up. I left instead of fighting for you." The admission hung between them. Maggie felt something shift, some ancient resentment beginning to crack. "I was angry for so long," it continued, "at you, at him, at myself, at a ghost I couldn't fight." He looked at her directly. "But when Grace called and said you almost died, I realized something. Anger is exhausting, and we don't have time for it anymore." Maggie felt tears building, both eyes working now, the right finally producing moisture. "I'm sorry for all of it. So am I." They sat in the quiet of shared regret. Outside the room, monitors beeped and nurses moved through hallways, and life continued around them, indifferent to their small moment of grace. "I didn't come back to reconcile," Tom said finally. "I came to say goodbye, properly this time. Goodbye to the anger, to the hurt, to all the what-ifs." He stood and put on his hat. "Take care of yourself, Maggie." Finally, he walked to the door, paused with his hand on the handle. He was lucky to be loved by you like that. Then he was gone. Maggie sat in the silence he left behind, feeling lighter somehow, as if a weight she'd carried for 56 years had finally been lifted. Not forgiveness exactly. It's something better. Release. Sarah returned an hour later, found her mother staring out the window with an expression she'd never seen before, something like peace. "What happened?" "He forgave me," Maggie said, "and I think I forgave him." That evening, as the sun set over Portland and the ICU settled into its night routine, Maggie was doing her facial exercises when she felt it. A twitch, small, barely there, but definitely present. On the right side of her nose, she froze, afraid to breathe, afraid it had been imagination. She tried again, concentrated on the right side of her face, willing it to move. Another twitch. Stronger this time. "Sarah!" Her voice came out louder than she intended. "Sarah!" And Sarah ran in from the hallway, fear on her face. "What's wrong? Look." Maggie tried to wrinkle her nose. The left side moved as it had been. The right side twitched, just barely, but unmistakably. Sarah's face transformed. "Do it again." Maggie did. The movement was tiny, almost nothing, but it was there. The facial nerve, traumatized but not dead, was beginning to wake up. Sarah pressed the call button. Within minutes, Dr. Morrison arrived. Called in from home, she performed a thorough examination, testing each facial muscle, documenting every tiny movement. "The nerve is regenerating," Morrison said, professional excitement barely contained. "This is excellent news." "Will I be normal?" Maggie asked. Morrison chose her words carefully. "Normal is relative. Will you have full function?" "Possibly. 70 to 80% is more likely. You'll have some asymmetry, some weakness, but you'll smile again, Mrs. Henderson. I can promise you that." After Morrison left, Emma arrived, Summoned by Sarah's text, she took photos of Maggie trying to smile, documenting the crooked, lopsided attempt that was nonetheless the most beautiful thing Sarah had seen in days. "For my project," Emma explained when Maggie protested the photos. "What project?" "You'll see." Over the next 5 weeks, Maggie's recovery progressed in small increments. She was discharged on September 24th with a regimen of physical therapy 3 times a week and facial exercises every 2 hours. Sarah moved into the guest room temporarily, working remotely from Maggie's kitchen table, driving her to appointments, cooking healthy meals that Maggie complained about constantly. Emma visited 2 or 3 times a week, always with her sketchbook, always working on her mysterious project. She'd set up her phone and record videos of Maggie talking, laughing, doing her exercises. Maggie tolerated it because refusing would have required more energy than she had. Grace came every morning at 9 for coffee, a ritual that quickly became essential to both women. They'd sit in the kitchen, talking about everything and nothing, and slowly Maggie learned what it meant to accept help without feeling diminished by it. By mid-October, Maggie's face had regained 60% of its function. She could smile. Though it was crooked, she could close her right eye. Though not completely, she could eat without food falling from her mouth, though she had to be careful. The scar behind her ear was still red and angry. But Dr. Morrison assured her it would fade with time. She stopped wearing hats indoors, stopped hiding from mirrors, started at answering the door when people knocked. Small victories that felt monumental. The metal box that had hidden in her nightstand for 56 years now sat on the mantel in the living room, open. James's photograph displayed beside her family photos, not hidden anymore, not shameful, just part of the story. On October 20th, Emma's midterm presentation day arrived. Maggie dressed carefully, Sarah helping with the buttons that still gave her trouble. They drove to the university together, entering a small gallery space where student artwork lined the walls. Emma's section was in the corner, spotlit and impossible to miss. 3 large photographs hung in sequence. The first showed Maggie in her garden on September 1st. Before everything changed, she looked strong, independent, at peace. The title card read, "Independence," with the caption, "She believed asking for help was weakness." The second photograph made Maggie's breath catch. It was from the ICU. Taken the night of her surgery, she lay unconscious, bandaged, vulnerable, surrounded by tubes and monitors. The image was stark, black and white, unflinching in its honesty. The title card read "Surrender," with the caption, "She learned it was strength." The third photograph was recent, taken just days ago. Maggie smiling her crooked smile, scar visible, face asymmetrical, but alive. The colors were warm, the lighting gentle. The title card read, "Survival," with the caption, "She chose to live, finally." But the centerpiece was what made Maggie's tears fall. A triptych of close-up portraits. On the left, young Maggie from a kid colorized from James's photograph. In the center, Maggie in the icy face half paralyzed. On the right, current Maggie with her crooked smile and visible scars. The title above all 3 read, "The Women Who Saved Herself." Emma stood when she saw them arrive, moving to stand beside her grandmother. Students and professors gathered as she began her artist's statement. My grandmother almost died from a spider in her ear, Emma said, her voice steady and clear. Not because the spider was poisonous, but because she was too proud to ask for help. For 56 years, she carried secrets, a love she couldn't claim, a marriage she couldn't save, a life she couldn't fully live. She raised 3 kids alone. She survived her husband leaving. She thought being strong meant never needing anyone. Emma looked at Maggie. But a tiny spider proved her wrong. This project isn't about my grandmother. It's about all of us. How many of us are dying slowly because we won't ask for help? How many secrets are poisoning us? My grandmother survived because 3 people wouldn't let her die alone. A neighbor who refused to stop caring, a daughter who drove 3 hours to hold her hand, and a man who died loving her from afar, who left her a letter that said, "Let people help." The room was silent, then applause. Her professor wiped her eyes. This is the most honest work I've seen in 30 years of teaching. Students gathered around, asking questions, sharing their own stories of stubborn grandparents who wouldn't see doctors, of family secrets kept too long, of the cost of pride. Maggie stood in front of her own image, tears streaming down both sides of her face now. The paralysis diminished enough that both eyes could cry. Emma had taken her brokenness and made it beautiful, had taken her shame and transformed it into art, had seen her at her worst and called her strong. "You made me beautiful," Maggie whispered. Emma hugged her carefully. "You always were. You just couldn't see it." That evening, back at home, Maggie made a decision. She picked up her phone and dialed a number she hadn't called in 5 years. Tom answered on the second ring. "It's Maggie. I'm having Thanksgiving dinner. You should come." A long pause. "Are you sure?" "No, but come anyway. I'll bring wine." After she hung up, Sarah looked at her with raised eyebrows. "Are you ready for that?" "No," Maggie admitted, "but I'm doing it anyway." On Thanksgiving morning, November 28th, Maggie's kitchen filled with the scent of turkey and pumpkin pie. The table was set for 6: Maggie, Sarah, Emma, Michael, who'd finally come home with his wife and new grandson, Grace, and Tom. When Tom arrived first with flowers and wine, the awkwardness lasted only moments before Grace broke it with her usual directness, pulling him into a hug and declaring him too thin. Michael arrived next, and Maggie held her first grandchild with trembling hands and a crooked smile that felt like the most beautiful thing in the world. As they gathered around the table, Grace raised her glass for a toast. 6 weeks ago, Maggie almost died because she was too stubborn to ask for help. Today, she asked all of us to be here. That takes more courage than dying alone. To Maggie, who finally learned what strength really means. The meal was imperfect, the turkey slightly dry, the conversation sometimes awkward, old wounds still tender. But as Maggie looked around at faces laughing and talking, at 3 generations gathered because she had finally been brave enough to say, "I need you," she understood what James had meant. Real strength wasn't doing it alone. It was trusting others to catch you when you fell. She was broken, scarred, imperfect, and for the first time in 56 years, she was free. Have you ever waited too long to ask for help because you didn't want to burden anyone? What finally made you reach out? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. let's talk about the courage it takes to be vulnerable and the freedom that comes with finally letting people in.